My ideas on European culture really come from my parents. They lived 60 years together, happily married, but they lived 60 years of cultural schizophrenia. My father was a Scot, a Protestant, a Presbyterian. That's a Calvinist religion, and he was a confirmed monarchist. My mother was Italian, from an old Catholic family of Romagna, which is a former papal state. She was a Republican and an admirer of the Enlightenment and of Garibaldi. So I tried for many years to understand this cultural schizophrenia that they had, and I came to the conclusion that this Northern European, that was my father, as a Protestant monarchist, was very, very far removed in terms of values and behaviors from my mother, who was a Southern European and a Catholic Republican. So then I went on to say, well, what does it mean to be monarchical and Protestant and Republican and Catholic, and how would that change values and behaviors in people? So if I treat first of all monarchy is 1,000 years old in Europe. It binds subjects to their feudal superiors. It was very successful as feudalism because it helped to raise armies to protect the monarch and his family, and it gave, and it's always given, a lot of importance to the protection of individual power and of family property from this impersonal body that we call the state. The identity of a community of citizens that we find in a republic has really got little weight in monarchy, where we speak not of citizens but of subjects. Machiavelli tells us why. The age-old aim of feudalism is to ensure the survival and protection of the prince, in his case, of a monarch, and that of his family, protecting their land from neighboring pilfering states. And this was largely served by institutionalizing mistrust of foreigners. We call this mistrust today xenophobia, and still find a lot more of it today in monarchies than we do in republics. During the Reformation in Northern Europe, this mistrust led to the creation of national Protestant churches, whereas in the south, the royal houses of France and Spain searched for alliance with the Roman Church. So the control of religion was a key factor of monarchical survival. Machiavelli, who was later quoted by Rousseau, who was a Republican, wrote in The Prince that a monarch can far more easily govern his subjects if he places religious power at his own service. Henry VIII had read his Machiavelli and created the Church of England to protect his own monarchical prerogative from dogmatic Catholicism, whilst usefully maintaining an institutionalized church. Monarchy is a last bastion of protection of individual and family property against a greedy state, which, as a republic, if we are to believe Rousseau, more readily defends the collective interests of the community against those of the individual. Monarchy is a protection of the royal family by a series of concentric social circles which separate subjects into classes, from the most aristocratic to the most untouchable, a society which leads each one to adapt his or her words to the social class of the other. So the master speaks differently to the servant than the way in which a servant replies to the master. So this strange relation of personal feudal service between master and servant, frankly, has no place for the team idea so dear to Republicans. It's far too personal. This relationship exalts the duties of the servant to his master, who in return provides security and privilege. Monarchy isolates people into their classes and unites them under their master, but not as a community. We see this in all walks of monarchical society, from the royal families and their aristocracy to relationships in the office with the boss. Monarchical societies have strict codes of communication both within classes and between them. These codes isolate and facilitate, but they don't unite. An aristocrat will feel more at home with a garbage collector speaking with an Oxford accent than a rich man speaking in estuary English. Class isolation encourages formality and secrecy, which a servant owes as a duty to his master, and hides a form of class violence, of inclusion and exclusion, which on the face of it looks surprisingly harmless. So, how does that affect the behavior and values of people who derive their values from monarchism? The first point, I think, is the acceptability of individual privilege, which, after all, has been accorded by the monarch, who is the fount of all honour, and which recognises that indeed men are not born equal at all. The protection at all costs of individual and family property and rights from the pilfering collective, starting, of course, with those rights of the first family of the land. The glorification of duty before that of rights. And our 19th century Victorian ancestors did much to fantasize how important it was for each man to do his duty, meaning to a monarch who, of course, impersonates the nation. And the virtual non-existent republican idea of the community of citizens, which is replaced in monarchy by the idea of nationhood, which is centered upon the person of the monarch, and a comfortable nationalized religion designed to control comfortably his subjects or her subjects. And finally, this compulsive distrust of other nations, each one invariably classed as a threat or not to the monarch's privilege and property. Secondly, what I call reformism. My father's family was Presbyterian. This form of Calvinist Protestantism was inspired by French Catholic theology dating to before the Reformation. It's a tough religion which is suited to rainy Scotland and which, unlike Catholicism, gives the rich a chance. Also, unlike Catholicism, it gives rather more weight to pragmatism than to post-biblical revelation, or what the Catholic Church calls tradition. But it leaves the believer far more lonely and accountable before God than does the far more optimistic theology of Rome. Classical Calvinism defends the tough doctrine of predestination, which does not mean that a man can earn salvation through his own works, but that he is subject to an unchangeable personal destiny. God knows from all eternity whether each man has been elected to paradise or condemned to burn in hell. Calvin deduces that despite the fact that God is all-knowing and all-powerful, if he willingly does not intervene to save the condemned man from hell during his lifetime, then such a man must be predestined to damnation, and that God must know this from all eternity. Calvin holds that because man's intelligence is God-given, any mystical construction to deny this idea of predestination is just not admissible. Calvin's thought is pragmatic and this worldly. He rejects the more optimistic Catholic doctrine of free will, which accepts that a man can somehow engineer his salvation in real time through good works and a return to virtue. According to Max Weber, an early 20th century German sociologist who identified the origin of capitalism with Calvinism, the Calvinist believer welcomes the money of this world as a gift from God given by God to the virtuous, hard-working man. Money granted to a man is a sign that God has elected him to a destiny in paradise. And since the virtuous man does not spend money for his own pleasure, his asceticism brings him to save his money up in the form of capital, unless he spends it to promote God's work. This certainly contradicts the Catholic Franciscan distrust of money I shall discuss later. Whilst recognizing that there are degrees of Protestantism covering the spectrum from Anglo-Catholicism to Calvinism, I still call the person who's brought up in Protestant society a reformist. Whether he is of Protestant or Catholic doctrine, he will still be a reformist because he's influenced by the values and behaviour of an essentially Protestant majority culture. So what do we mean by reformist values? They're characterized by this pessimistic sense of loneliness before one's destiny, described by Max Weber, which leads a man to examine his own behavior and that of others for signs of virtue to understand whether he is destined for heaven or for hell. This gives the reformist a relatively rigid view of what virtue is, and we call this moral absolutism. Also, his suspicion of the poor, who because they are poor are probably not virtuous and not part of God's elect, and who are destined, yes, but possibly not for heaven. His greater comfort too with the human thought of this world, which is analytical, linear, empirical, and which essentially rejects mystic conjecture about the other world. In this way, the reformist is a pragmatist and distrusts dogmatism. His preference for what we call inductive thought, which follows a logic cycle of facts, outcomes, and conclusions. This is faster, if less precise, as a way of reaching a conclusion than the more laborious deductive method of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which we call Cartesian, and which, for the reformists, probably wastes too much time. And this preoccupation with time, which is a gift of God to man, and which is too precious to waste. We're going to quantify time. We're going to save it. So we quantify time in reformist society. His admiration of modesty and asceticism, including a prevailing dislike of showing emotion, which the virtuous are not expected to show. So now I've described some of the key drivers of monarchical and reformist values that were my father's. Let's look at the Republican and Romanist values that were my mother's. I'll start with republicanism. Despite Mussolini's support of the House of Savoy, so a monarchist support, the ideas of my mother were nevertheless inspired by a frankly Republican ethic. She grew up in the wake of the Risorgimento, this popular movement that was a fruit of the Enlightenment and of the romantic image of a unified Italy under Garibaldi, Mazzini, and Cavour. She was influenced by the concept of the Commune, as we saw in Paris in 1870, and by this sacred ideal of a state which was promoted by the French revolutionaries of 1789 to counter the idea of an anointed monarch. So when, with the help of France, the Risorgimento ended in unifying Italy, France was in the grips of the Franco-Prussian War and of the egalitarian and fraternal Paris Commune. The leading Italian statesman Mazzini had distinctly Republican tastes and set about building a new constitution